Yeah, I started an hour and a half early today and just barely had time. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know why, but I guess I'm just that kind of loser. I don't know.
Well, it definitely takes me a lot longer than that to write my notes. So
Mm.
yeah, if I started at 1:30, I would struggle quite a lot.
See, I'm normally starting around 2,
Mm-hmm.
but you give me the easy stuff typically anyway.
Well,
So
because I know you'll start it late. I don't. That's why, because I don't want
yeah,
you to not have time to do it. So, um,
yeah.
yeah.
I've consistently set these low expectations and failed to meet them. So
There
that
you go.
at least I'm consistent.
Um, Hi, everyone. Welcome to Wheel of Mind, the Wheel of Time point of view reread podcast. In this bonus season, we are reading perspectives from some of Matt Cawthon's friends. Welcome to what we're calling Season 2.5, Episode 11, where we're discussing Olver's point of view, his entire point of view in this episode. I'm your co host, Lajara Dane of the White Aja.
Hi, and I'm Giskel Simarus, a scholar from Ilion. For any new listeners to our series, I want to remind you that The Wheel of Mind is an in depth character reread podcast, and we may drop spoilers at random times, so this is your only spoiler warning. Today, we are examining The Towers of Midnight Epilogue and chapters 35, 37, and 39 from A Memory of Light. I'll get us started with the epilogue from Towers of Midnight. Olver seems to have picked up some bad habits from, I don't know, someone. Playing snakes and foxes, he says time to roll the dice in the old tongue before his toss. A very lucky roll with no wavy lines or triangles on any of the dice. He hid both his pain at the memory of his father having made this game for him, as well as his anger at the Shido who had later killed his father. Warriors always hid their feelings, after all. Oliver wasn't supposed to know that Matt and Noel were in the Tower of Genji right now, but he was no fool. He had helped Matt with information about the snakes and foxes, after all. He just hoped that Matt would help him when it was his time to go someday. He would need some answers to find the Shido who had killed his father. Talmanas rolled when it was his turn, but he was mostly paying attention to his book. Talmanas was way too stiff. He was just no fun at all. Then Oliver rolled again, and it was another good roll. He moved his game piece, and then was shocked to find that he was in the center spot. I won! He exclaimed. Talmanas thought that they had miscounted or something, but Oliver knew better. He had been close to giving up, but he knew that it would have to happen someday. It had been just a matter of time before he won. In a bit, Oliver grew bored again and began poking around the tent. Talmanas had gone back to his book, paying no attention to him at all. That was when Oliver found an old shabby letter that lay unopened on Matt's desk. He must have forgotten about it. Matt needed a lot of looking after all. Oliver had best check this letter out, as it could be something important. So he opened it and struggled with some of the words for a few moments, having trouble with them. Talmanas, he said, you should probably read this. After Talmanas totally freaked out over Varen's letter, he finally read it. Then he read it again. Then he swore, grabbing his sword and running out of the tent. You see, Oliver hadn't understood the part of the letter about the waygates, but he did know what shadow spawn were. Then in the dark of the night there was the glow of flames above the city. The warning in the letter had come too late. As Talmanas began raising the band and leading them toward Camelin, Oliver went and got the large knife that he had kept hidden. He had sworn after Kyrian that he would never be a coward again. And the chapter ends with this quote, "It was time to fight."
Oliver is one of these characters that once Sanderson gets his hands on them, they end up getting very much fleshed out. He didn't have a point of view before the Sanderson books. This is his first one at the end of Towers of Midnight. So it took a long time, even though we first met him in Lord of Chaos, maybe Fires of Heaven, Fires of Heaven, I believe in Mayron.
Right. I think so.
Yeah, so he's been in the story for a while, but mostly as this little joke in the background to show us how much he's picking up from Matt. He gives us some eyes on Matt that we're not always getting from Matt's perspective, right? And we know that Matt isn't very
Yes.
honest with himself. So Oliver is, even though he has, a dark backstory, he's normally in the story pretty much for laughs. But here we really get into his head and find out. We're just reminded of his painful past and kind of this darkness that he has within him because he plans to take revenge on the Shido, and he also plans to visit the Aelfin. And so he's setting himself up for some really dangerous career choices right now, which is, I
Right.
guess, not surprising when you look at his role models. And he started out extremely angry at Aiel. So Robert Jordan did write that about him for sure. I'm not saying Sanderson is alone in bringing out this kind of darkness in him. It's kind of good to see that at least his vengeance quest has gotten narrowed down and tempered some. So in the beginning, I mean, he would have stabbed Avienda if anybody had given him a chance, right?
Right.
He was against all Aiel. And he has been educated on this some and finally come around to the fact that the Shido are a different group of Aiel. And he's also come around to thinking that he only needs to get vengeance on the one guy who killed his dad. So earlier in his journey, I can imagine even when he first learned that Shido are a separate clan and that no other Aiel did this to his town or anything, he probably would have wanted to kill any Shido he came across. But now it's really focused on the one guy. So that shows some maturity, a little more understanding about the world, but it's still concerning. It's still a vengeance quest, right?
Yes. Yes.
It's interesting now that Sanderson is writing him. Once we get here, it seems like there's so much more of a future for Oliver, and we can really imagine what kind of trouble he will get into as he grows up, seeing that these are the thoughts he's having about his goals at such a young age. He's got such violent goals. He wants to do really dangerous stuff like visit the Aelfin, and also knowing that him winning this game right now, it doesn't look to me at least like just an interesting coincidence. Like, oh, this happened right at the same moment that Matt was cutting his way out of the tower. It looks like Oliver's being foreshadowed to go confront them in the future.
Right. Right.
I just find that really interesting. It's very similar to how Matt and Tuon feel like they're at the beginning of some new arc together. Oliver feels like he's at the beginning of something, and we could really just imagine what type of character he could be. And I don't know that there were necessarily any plans to include Oliver in the Outrigger novels or something that had been talked about with Matt and Tuon going back to Shan-Chan and all that. But I do just wonder what kind of place in the world Oliver could have as he grows up. And I think this is just another illustration that one reason many of us love the Wheel of Time so much is that it feels like stuff was happening in this world before we came into it, and it's going to keep happening after we leave it at the end of A Memory of Light.
Right, right. We feel like we step into a story and then step out of it rather than having one from beginning to end because there are no beginnings and no endings with the turning of the wheel of time. So
As we know.
he did such a great job of doing that. And I wonder, this is a little off topic, I suppose, but I wonder how much of what is written here in this part is just Sanderson or how much might have come from Robert Jordan's notes and things he had
Oh, right.
intended to put into the story, and I
Mhm.
don't know the answer to that. Maybe someone has run across a, interview with him or something where this was explained a little more, rather
Mhm.
an interview with Jordan, where this was explained a little more, because I always felt like that somehow Oliver was either sort of a reflection of himself, because we know Robert Jordan's real name was Oliver Rigney Jr.
Oh, yes,
And so
okay.
it's kind of a twist on his name, or is it a tribute to his father? So is it something
Mm.
to show kind of the impish and funny side of his nature to sort of insert himself on the story, or is this a tribute to his father who I don't know about his father, but perhaps it was just a way to, put a character that was sort of loosely based on him who would grow into, a very good man someday. So if any of our listeners do know or can point to some, podcasts or interviews with either Sanderson or Robert Jordan, please let us know because I would
Mm.
love to have that information and I have not thought to look it up or have not found it myself. As far as in this point of view in the story, I personally see when Oliver gets these two perfect rolls of the dice, and they have to be perfect. If one of the dice would have had the symbol of the foxes or the snakes, then he couldn't have won. That's one thing that makes this game impossible to win. You
Hmm.
have to have a series of perfect throws, which we all know cannot happen. Well, we see it happen with Matt quite often. So my first
Right.
thought is, in studying this, is Oliver maybe slightly Taveran, or is this pointing to the fact that he someday will be Taveran? Because it seems to be something that doesn't occur in a person's life until it's needed in a person's life. Or more likely, probably, I had the thought that it could be Matt's Taveran nature sort of reaching through the pattern and giving Oliver this win as a message to say, hey, they can be beaten. We just won. We survived this. Not intentional, something
Oh,
unknowing
right.
and unintentional,
Hmm.
but just his Taveran nature
Like an
affecting
omen,
something.
perhaps.
Yes, yes. Because the Taveran nature would have had to have affected things in the pattern far across the world for Matt to have gotten that black yew staff with which he made a longbow, for him to
Hmm.
find the razor horse for as a gift for Tuon. So we know that Tavarian nature does not just affect things in their immediate vicinity, but it causes these coincidences wherever they need to happen.
I have read it as a clue that Olver's business with them is not finished.
Oh, right, right. Oh, I believe that completely.
So
In
I
fact,
never was sure exactly of I guess, the mechanism here of how this happened or why. I kinda like the omen theory of Matt's Tavernus reaching through and kind of, showing this symbol from the pattern, but I also yeah, strangely, when the first time I read this passage, and even when I reread it, I think because we might have covered a chapter that had this in it, like somebody else's point of view. I don't remember, but I've reread it for some reason, and I misread it and thought that Oliver was going to go kill the Aelfin, not just get an answer
mm,
from the Aelfin to kill the one Shido guy who killed his dad. So
right,
I have been reading this passage a little differently until I actually did a closer reading today to notice what he meant about why he was going to visit the Aelfin. But I still
right.
think because he won against them here, he's going to try to win against them later. And I really think he's going to do something unconventional against them. He's going to, I don't know, do something Matt like and end up. I don't know if he's going to come out of it okay. I don't know if that's actually what would happen, but I think that's what he wants to do anyway.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely in his mind. He thought about it here, and in the next chapter that I review in a few minutes, he spells it out again. So he
Mm,
delineates this twice in thought, not out loud,
yeah.
but in thought, internal monologue, that this is what he's going to do. So he has a plan that involves using the fin. He really does. Now, also, I felt like there was a parallel in what happened here because he wins the game and then he fiddles around, finds the letter, opens it, and of course Talmanis is at first horrified at the fact that he opened the letter, and now they're tied to this White Tower politics that they feared. But then was horrified to find out the city of Camlin's on fire, that the warning came too late. And I felt like that was really a parallel to Matt and ToM and Moiraine surviving the Tower of Genji, yet there was a terrible cost there.
Hmm.
It cost Noel his life. And
Mm.
this, you right on the heels of winning, there's this terrible cost of a blow against our side. We lose a major city instead of a major character. There's many people that die in this, innocent civilians. The story is not told of how many people were cowering in their homes until the Trollocs find them and put them into cook pots. That some people were saved from that, some were not. We know many members of the band do not survive this. Many members of the Camlin military do not survive this. So, yeah, there is a cost to winning. Even when you win against all odds, there's still a terrible cost. And I found this to be somewhat of a parallel, as well as obviously a parallel with the last battle. You win it, but winning a war is Matt had let us know in his point of view is the second greatest tragedy or the second greatest
Mm,
time of mourning.
right.
The only thing worse is losing it.
Yeah, there definitely is. The Lesser Sadness, I believe, is one of the chapter names in the Fires of
Oh,
Heaven.
thank you. Yes, I couldn't get the correct
Yeah.
word. Thank you for that. Yes, the
Well, I
lesser
think we did
sadness.
the opposite. So I remembered the term "the Lesser Sadness" in a much older episode of ours, and then I couldn't I couldn't get out the quote, like, in any sensible way of explaining what that actually meant. So here
Yes.
we are, two halves
Yeah.
of a whole person who can explain a passage.
And I'll kind of end my remarks on this with one quote that I really liked from this point of view that Oliver had. It's when he was looking around, seeing the letter, and kind of going through Matt's stuff, and he said to himself, "quote After Lopin was gone, Matt would need extra taking care of. It was one of the reasons Oliver stayed with the band. He was not sure what Matt would do without him." End quote. So I love the way he rationalizes it. And of course,
Mhm.
I don't know where in the world he would have gotten this. He has to rationalize the things he does in a way that totally avoids the truth, the heart of the subject.
Right,
But
right. He did the same thing with opening the letter. He had all these
yes,
explanations for why, like, he had to keep convincing himself after he did it.
right, right. And this was part of that before he did it. Well, I've got to help take care. I'm a
Well, yeah.
messenger for Matt after all. And then he does it, like you said, yeah, then he comes up with all these other rationalizations for what he did.
Well, Mistress Anon said, "I'm pretty sure from what I remember, you need to be nice and respond to letters people send you."
Yes. That's true. That's true. And, the thing is, he was right, though.
Yeah,
And not in the fact that he didn't know what Matt would do without him, or that's the reason he stayed with the band. That's just total bunk. He stayed with the band because he had nowhere to go.
yeah.
He had lost everyone, so this was the only family he had. But the fact that he was trying to help, think what might have happened had he not stepped in to help at that moment. Had he
Mhm.
not been nosy and going through Matt's things, because it would have taken the band a lot longer to respond. If they had responded at all. What if they had just gotten up the next morning and realized Camlin had fallen and it was all
Mhm.
gone? I mean, the city
Yeah.
was pretty much laid to waste anyway, but there would have been so many more people killed. So it's greater loss of life and greater loss of armies had the band not ran in at the time that they did, and at least managed to save some people and to save the dragons. And the other things that really helped them in their portion of the last battle, the things that did play a very important part.
Absolutely. We keep getting pieces of stuff in these earlier Oliver points of view of very key things for the last battle. As you said, saving the dragons and Oliver himself. We're going to get there soon enough, but you've got a chapter before that. So I want to
Okay.
make sure you have time to get to that.
All right. Thank you. So we'll now get into A Memory of Light, chapter 35. So we're jumping ahead near the end of the story here. Oliver rode Bella through the blight. Mistress Satellanon, Fail, and the others tried to protect him, but Oliver didn't need any protecting. He had his knife, and he knew that Trollocs would underestimate him. Only Trollocs were not the only danger here in the blight. As they traveled, he saw a man killed by a tree, and that was the 15th man to die in just a few days. Oliver went over his plan to one day train with the Aiel so that he could know how that they fought. Then he could go visit the Finn and get the answers needed to locate the Shido who had killed his father. Oh, it would make an epic story. He could take Noel with him. Oh, then he remembered that Noel was dead. Matt, it seems, had run off with the Seanchan. Talmanes was off fighting with Queen Elaine's army, and now the blight was killing everyone around him. Oliver coaxed the slow pony up the line of people until he was close to Lady Fail, Aravine, and Vannon. He kept looking away so that they wouldn't think he was eavesdropping, which of course he wasn't. He needed to get out of the dust of their horses. But he did overhear them talking about the blasted lands that they were heading into, and realized that the mountain up ahead in the distance was Sheol Ghul. That was okay with Oliver because he knew that Matt would probably be there instead of back at the field of Marilor, and Oliver would show him just how tough he was in battle. Then Matt would not leave him again. Quote, and nobody would take those he loved from him ever again. End quote.
Oliver has a little bit more honesty with himself in this chapter. Not a ton. He does admit to himself that the blight is pretty scary, which is more honesty with himself than we see from Matt and more than we have seen from Oliver at this point. He's usually got some other justifications. Now he's still finding all these other justifications for eavesdropping and things like that. But he's improving a little bit, and that's not the only thing he has been building on either, is his self genuineness of his explanations to himself. He's also been building on his vengeance quest plan. I found that really interesting. Not now, as you noted in your summary, he is not only going to train with the band to learn how to fight, that was the original plan from last chapter, and then go to the Aelfin. He's now going to also train with the IEL. So he's added another little educational step. He's got to get an internship, I guess. He can't just go straight from college to this job.
Right, right.
So he's
But
learned a little more
and
about what it requires.
notice it, well, I didn't give it in the summary, but when you look at the story, you read that part of it, he says, what he'll do is he'll go and he'll live among them for a while, and they will treat him very badly until they finally begin to respect him, and then they'll begin
Mm,
training him,
mhm.
which is pretty much how the IEL work. I mean, he's got
Yeah,
that down pat. He's
that's
listened to some
true.
stories. He knows kinda how they work, that they would, yeah, they would treat him as some soft wetlander, and, if they probably wouldn't kill him outright, but once he proved himself stubborn enough and all that, then they would begin to take him in and train him. I don't know that it would happen that way, but at least he's got somewhat of a realistic plan there about how that would go. He doesn't just think like most children would, well, I'll just go in and I'll convince them and they'll take me in and start teaching me. He
Mm.
knows it would be difficult. He understands that there would be the need to prove himself to them.
I think too, he talks about how that comes from stories. And so I read that a little differently than you. I was thinking of it as being a little more naive because he's heard a lot of these scenarios from stories where somebody ends up going native. We have a lot of these from like the American West frontier with Native Americans,
Yes, yes.
stories that are similar to this. But I think in this world, they probably have them about any kind of nomadic people who are not settled and who are known as hard warriors. I think you could drop this type of story archetype of soft, settled person proves themselves and learns from these people after being treated harshly as a prisoner or whatever. It's a trope. So I don't know whether he's really just got good information or whether he's just kind of going off of story tropes.
Yeah, true. At least in my mind, I guess I took it that way. What I did not expect, and I had caught it before, the both times through the story, but it was just sort of an unsettling feeling, and I never voiced it.
Hmm.
But we see here what we've seen with pretty much every major character in this story, even though he's a minor character, he still has the same trait. We see the thread of darkness there in his
Hmm.
life, in his mind,
Yeah.
when he starts saying, "I'll do this and I'll prove myself, and nobody will ever take the people I love from me again."
Mm.
And
Sounds like some Anakin stuff right there
yes,
or
it does.
something.
That's what I thought exactly. Anakin
Yeah.
Skywalker, yes. That fear, and because he has lost so many people, and this comes on the
Hmm.
heels of thinking about losing Noel and how Matt, went over here and Talmon is over there and he's not with the band anymore. Everybody's left him. And now the blight is killing off the people around him. And he
Mm.
even says, why don't they come for me? To me, that's sort of the mark of someone who has gone through a lot of trauma,
Mhm.
or a mark. There are a lot of markers for people who's gone through a lot of trauma. And there's a quote I'm going to give real quick that really summed this up for me. It said, quote, "It seemed as if he had lived three lives, one before his parents died, one when he had been alone, and now this one," end quote. And I think of the people I've spoken to who have lost a child or gone through some other just horrific traumatic event in their lives. They said their lives are automatically split in two. There's before and there's after. And it's just like two totally different lives. With Oliver here, it's been compounded. There's his happy life when it was he and his parents and Kyrian. There's the time he was alone, which was probably just a big series of traumatic events. And
Mhm.
then there's after he met with Matt and the band and has been a part of them. And it's things are so different in his life following these series of traumatic sequences that he really feels like he's lived three totally separate lives. I think that is a succinct way of describing how many people feel. I don't believe he has good coping mechanisms for this.
Mm,
He
right.
certainly does not have anyone to help guide him through this. I would love for there to be some sisters of the tower who could recognize and perhaps work with him to be able to come to grips with some of the things he's gone through and to be able to process some of the things he's gone through. Because I feel like there would be people there who have been trained to to deal with people. I don't know. It's heartbreaking for me. It's
It
heart wrenching.
is.
Even though this is a fictional character, it brings up things you see actually in people's real lives.
Absolutely.
Um, and just this feeling of isolation, of having, losing the people he loves, and that's his greatest fear. It has to be his
Mhm.
greatest fear after losing his father, losing his mother, and then losing Noel. Everyone he's grown close to has left him for one reason or another.
Yeah.
And and it made me, when I went back and thought of at the last battle when he and Matt are flying in on the Rockin', and Oliver is just so happy. And
Mhm.
at the time I took it, he's flying. He's a kid, he's enjoying flying. He's also enjoying being with Matt because here's somebody who probably will not walk away from him.
Right.
And it's the closest thing he's got to a father figure now, and he loves Matt that much that I think
Mhm.
that's a second reason that Oliver's just bubbling over with joy because it's him and Matt against the Dark One in his mind, and
Yeah.
he's ready for that fight because if Matt's with him, yeah, let's take on anybody. I'm game. Let's do it. Where, we
Yes.
don't see when he's alone, and we'll get into some of your points of view in a little bit, things are very different for him. He's in
Mm.
a very different place. So,
Mhm.
and one last thing, you've already alluded to it, but I wanted to sum this up with another quote. You know how I love to pull quotes out of these stories. Quote, most women liked his grin. He had been practicing it, though he didn't use Matt's grin as a model. Matt's always made him look guilty. End quote. So I thought that was just so good. Matt thinks his grin is so award winning, but we've gotten it from Brigitta first and now
Yeah.
from Oliver. No, his grin makes him look guilty. He does not realize how he looks to other people.
For different reasons too, because Brigitta thought
Yes.
he was leering, and now Oliver thinks he just looks too
Yeah.
mischievous or guilty. So they're both reading this really differently than
Yes.
Matt
Yes.
himself does, his winning smiles. I mean, Oliver himself talks about how this is a strategy. I mean, it's not just a way to be cute and kind of playful and fun. It's a I mean, he says that you learned grins when you were forced to fend for yourself.
Right.
And he needed one to help him seem innocent and to elicit kindness from people.
Right.
I mean, it was a funny quote because I'm thinking about his role models and how he's already doing one better, right? He's getting better at being a little more honest with
Yeah.
himself than Matt. He's
Right.
getting better at the grins. Um, but it also goes back to the trauma you were talking about, and the fear of abandonment and everything else. He feels the need to do certain things to get basic needs from people because when he was on the streets, he had to have these innocent looking smiles in order to get away with stealing a little bread or something
Right.
like that or
Right.
whatever else, right? Lots of traumatized people also have a similar response when they're faced with threatening people. Smiling is a way to look really non-threatening, right? It's
Right.
even other primates do this because when you smile and your lips are kind of stretched out, you make a higher pitched noise, and higher pitched sounds come from smaller animals typically. So you're basically sending the message like, I'm small. I'm not a threat to you. Don't hurt me.
Mm.
Women especially do this fawning response, is what they call it. So it's not only fight or flight or freezing responses you can get when kind of trauma is triggered, especially interpersonal trauma, but you can fawn. You can be kind of excessively sweet to send that message. Please don't hurt me. Oliver is thinking about this in kind of a funny way right now. So he I don't feel like he's, triggered thinking about it in this way or whatever, but that does kind of explain how he's got a better grin than Matt does because he really has had to put it to use
Yes.
way more practical and important ways.
Right. Right.
And he's also not only wanting to send the message that he's not a threat and that he's innocent, he does stuff to send a message that he's useful. That's why he won't
Yes.
accept money from Matt. He has this fear of abandonment, right? Like you were
Right.
talking about, he abandonment through death or just leaving him with somebody else, like Matt has done right now. So if he can only be useful, he can deserve for people to keep him around and meet
Right.
his basic needs. Is kind of the mindset that he has, which is terribly sad, right? Because nobody really should have to prove themselves worthy to just have basic needs
Right.
met, but especially children when it comes to food,
Right.
shelter, that kind of stuff, just basic love.
And right, and affection, yes, thank you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Affection. Yeah. We absolutely need to talk about the psychological needs, not just the physical ones. But yeah, so it's sad that that's why he wants to be a messenger or something, why that reasoning worked with him. He wanted to earn his keep, why he wants his fighting skills, not just for vengeance, but so Matt won't leave him behind anymore. He can be useful and actually fight with the band. It's sad, but it gives us so much insight into who Oliver is and why he does what he does. So I just really have enjoyed these deep dives. It makes so much sense to me. Just like you said, it shows patterns of how people actually act in the real world. He's just very well written in these small points of view.
Right. No, he really is. Do you wanna take us on into the last battle to look at Oliver some more?
Yes. So the structure of this was a little difficult. I will say, as we know, the last battle is a monster of a chapter. I want to give us a little bit of a bridge from your chapter 35 also to explain what's been going on. We see Oliver through his perspective, but also through Fail's perspective because they're together for part of this journey. And then he's got like 4 or 5 different small points of view in chapter 37, and then 2 that are just like half a paragraph. I mean, really tiny in chapter 39. So I'm really squishing all this together where I've got the bridge from 35, I've got these little points of view from 37, the last battle, and then I've got our final points of view from chapter 39 because there wasn't a good place to break that off and then have commentary after each one of those. So before our monster chapter, the last battle begins, back at the end of chapter 35, we had a Fail perspective where she believed that somebody had tried to steal the horn of Valir from her chest, and Vannon and Harnan happened up on the horn. It turns out later they were trying to steal Tabak, but she doesn't know that yet. And then they ran away when she went to confront them because there was also some monster threatening all 3 of them at the time. So Fail grabbed the horn where Vannon dropped it, and she put it in a sack that she kept on her person instead of the chest in her tent now. And then Fail and the rest of them chased Vannon and Harnan deeper into the blasted lands toward Thakandar, and that's where chapter 37, the last battle, finds her and Olver. She had some regrets for bringing along the boy, but then again, Borderlanders his age were already trained in armies, if not actually fighting. They were running messages and stuff like that until around age 12 when they would start training. She spotted a caravan that appears to go to some village and supply center from which the armies of the Shadow look like they're receiving weapons by a gateway, even though the Shadow Spawn themselves can't travel by gateway. So Fail planned to sneak them through one of those onto the field to Marilor to deliver the horn to Matt. They attacked a merchant caravan along the way, offered freedom to the captives, half of whom came with them still, and they dressed up as the caravan with Aravine, who had sworn fealty to Fail back in Malden, acting as the merchant, and Fail herself was acting as a captive, which really surprised Oliver that she could be so submissive. He didn't predict that. Oliver himself was carrying a sack of arrows that would get in the way of fighting, so he was pretty annoyed with that, and it was really starting to get heavy too. He had to keep his head down and look convincing as a captive in the face of the red-veiled Aiel that they saw and the dark friends who met them at the supply dump. A Murdral also came by to check for channelers and left, apparently satisfied. They went through the gateway as they were led into the even rockier land and a drier heat. And this area was full of Trollocs and cookpots. It was just really gruesome. Fael decided that their options, like resistance or waiting for rescue or sneaking away, were all futile. So the plan was to scatter and hope that some people could get away. That was until Aravine came back through a gateway with a channeling woman in white who wrapped up and gagged Fael in flows of air while some of her soldiers fought against the red-veiled Aiel and other dark friends. Oliver was surprised at just how fast real fighting was. Nobody told him it was like that. Aravine revealed that it was she who betrayed them, having received orders before they even left Andor. She tried to escape her orders and repent, but dark friends cannot slip the net in this way, apparently. They will always find you. Oliver realized he needed to act quickly, so he stabbed the channeling woman in the back, causing Fael to fall, and then pens of captives broke free and began fighting the humans and the Trollocs who had been keeping them there. Aravine escaped with the horn, but with the help of Vannon and Harnan, who showed up and explained that they weren't trying to steal the horn earlier, Fael was able to kill Aravine with a quick throw of a knife. But her human and Trolloc pursuers knew that she had the horn, so she covertly gave it to Olver, who was huddled under a wagon, and she kept the empty sack for herself to draw attention away from him. Trollocs quickly found his hiding place and overturned the wagon, so he fled on Bella, who was suddenly faster than his racehorse Wind could ever have run. She was taken down by an arrow, and Olver ran to hide in a cleft in a rocky outcrop, cowering from clawing and digging hands trying to reach him. And this leads us now into Olver's brief points of view in chapter 39, Those Who Fight. In desperation, he blew the horn before it was snatched away. A Trolloc pulled him out of his hiding place, but soon dropped him as Noel, now a hero of the horn, came to his rescue. Quote, he had lost so many people, but one of them, one, had come back for him. End quote. And thus ends Olver's point of view in A Memory of Light. Just to give you a quick follow up on where his story ends from others' points of view, the last we hear of him, as you mentioned earlier, was him flying on a rockin' with Matt to Shale Ghul. The creature was shot down. The pilot didn't make it, but Matt and Olver were okay. Olver blew the horn again there, and Brigitta told Olver to throw the horn deep into the ocean somewhere so that he couldn't be used because of his connection to it. And so that is the end of Olver's story.
When you got to the point where the Trollocs drug him out of the crack in the rock and Noel was there to fight for him, I got chills. Just
Mm-hmm.
hearing you sum it up, I certainly did during the story. My first time reading through the story, it was a few years ago, and just a few months ago, I finished up my reread, and somehow I had forgotten this moment until I hit it in the reread, and it just again I got chills then, but even now, just with your summary of it, because that's such a perfect part of the story. And you know what I said before about Oliver having this thread of darkness in him?
Mm-hmm.
We discussed how it seems like every one of our major characters could go really good or really bad. And this was kind of Oliver's turning point. I feel like he could have chased vengeance in a desire to never lose anyone again, to prove himself to be so good that no one would ever abandon him again. Though we've talked about that being a very sad thing. It would be totally untrue, but that's the damage to his psyche.
Mm-hmm.
And here someone came back for him. And you know that Oliver, he feels loved and he
Mm-hmm.
feels worthy. And I guess maybe even that's a bad term. Feels like he doesn't have to be worthy because he kind of showed himself a coward in some ways, hiding in that rock, in the cleft of the rock, afraid, fear just all over him. He trying to climb up, trying to climb away, couldn't get away from the grasping hands and digging hands of the Trollocs. And he was just so filled with fear because he's a child. You have to remind yourself of this, that he's showing a natural, normal reaction, something he should feel,
Mm-hmm.
and reacting in ways he should react. But he wanted to be something so different, but he learned he didn't have to prove himself in order to have somebody who wouldn't leave him. He didn't have to prove himself to have worth and dignity and love. He
Mm-hmm.
had to just because these people love him. I think on one of our last times going through the events from Matt's point of view, when they hear the horn blow and you see Hawkwing and the others of the heroes rise in this fog, like, and they said, then you see one that turns and sped away. And
Yeah.
that's when I realized he said something to Hawkwing
Couldn't
and then
see who it
turned and sped
was.
away.
Yeah.
That was Noel. Yeah. And that, it's one of the things I didn't catch through my read through. I caught when we were doing our deep dive into that portion of the last
Mm-hmm.
battle from Matt's point of view. This is the thing that keeps the darkness from overwhelming Oliver,
Mm.
is the fact Noel comes back for him, and then he's with Matt again later, who is that father figure. I
Yeah.
guess you could think of Noel as almost like a beloved grandfather to him.
Yeah.
And these are the two he feels complete. And that's how affection and family ties should be, even though they're not tied by blood. He's not
Mm-hmm.
tied by blood to either of them. But that's not what defines a family either. That one really hits me in the feels.
Oh yeah, me too. Me too. It was very difficult for me to cry while I was rereading parts of these chapters to summarize them. The
Yes.
part where he
Yes.
cries over Bella and says she was really a good horse. I'm doing it right now.
Oh, yes.
And then when the Trolloc drops him and he sees it as Noel, and he said that somebody had come back for him. I quoted it earlier. I'm not going to do it again because I will just full
Right.
on
You
cry.
can't right now. Yeah. They can make you ugly cry. I mean,
Yeah, yeah. I was like,
yeah.
okay, I don't have time for this. I got stuff to do. Let's, steamroll past that really quickly.
And it was so difficult for me going through Oliver's point of view just on the read through. I didn't hit the points you did, but where he crawls into that cleft in the rock and is hiding, and I felt his fear. That was so well written,
Yeah.
and you could picture it, you could see it so clearly in your mind. And I kept wanting to think, just climb up, Oliver, climb up, and they can't reach it, but he couldn't. He was doing
Mm.
everything he could do, and I felt his fear. I felt his helplessness. It's not really a point of redemption, but this point of joy and how it turns,
Mm-hmm.
and how he's rescued, and it's so perfectly done that, and it still blows me away. The more I think about it, the more it blows me away of how well it was done, just with Noel being that hero of the Horn. And we've talked about it before. We don't know if he became a hero of the Horn because of his actions with Matt and company, or was he always a hero of the Horn? And this was just another iteration of it, a time when
Mm.
a life he didn't live quite as well as some of the others. And it doesn't really matter. He's there, and he was there for Oliver, which is what we needed.
Mm. I didn't think about it this way, but you talked about this moment as being a turning point for Oliver in terms of his future, the types of things we were worried about for him. I think that that's very consistent with how characters change sometimes in this series and also in Brandon Sanderson's writings independently. Rand has his moment on Dragonmount. I'm thinking of Veins of Gold, where somebody changes permanently based on a small moment, an instantaneous type of
Right.
thing. And Sanderson tends to do epiphanies a lot with his characters in Mistborn and Stormlight. I suppose this could be a similar turning point. It's one where I can buy that in the story, especially since this is fantasy. But Oliver, even though he has this moment of love and he has these moments of joy with Matt, I still see so many factors that make him like an at-risk youth, as we might call it.
Oh
So many
yes.
factors where it's like, where does he fit in the future? Where does he fit with Matt now being Shanchan, basically? Is he
Right.
going back to the continent with them? Where's the rest of the band going? What kind of, is Oliver going to be soldiering for his future, or are they going to make sure he has like a court education from now on? It's probably a little late to start that type of stuff with him, but I wonder if the Shanchan are going to try if he
Right.
goes there. But I just don't know, like, officially where he fits anywhere, and if he's going to continue to have the unconditional support that he needs in order to grow up to be healthier and not so kind of violent and scary like he has the
Right.
potential to do. Now, I don't think that the story is really taking us that way. I think we're meant to get some closure and feel better for Oliver in the way that you
Yes.
outlined, but I'm still just looking at are the facts of what's
Right.
there, like what
Right.
supports does he have, and I'm still finding that those seem to be in question to me.
Right.
So if we were to imagine what happens next for him, it's still a question mark for me.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he's got to go home with somebody
Yeah.
because he doesn't have one, and he doesn't have anybody. And there are so many people this way. I guess in my imagination, I would like to see after the last battle, new communities formed, just as refugees poured into the two rivers and it changed and
Hmm.
grew. New communities formed from people who have nowhere to go, who've lost
Yeah.
everything, and just
Lots of found family, like Oliver
right, right,
has.
yeah,
Mm.
just people coming together. Okay, yeah, I've lost my husband, my children. With you as a child, just come live with me, and here's just different people coming together like that. But in Oliver's case, I imagine him staying with Matt.
Hmm.
I can imagine him being a joy to Matt's heart, but a thorn in his side at the same
Yeah.
time. And I
Uh-huh.
don't think having the support, knowing that Noel came back for him, knowing he had Matt with him, I don't
Mm.
think that changes the fact he's going to visit the Finn someday.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
I could kind of picture in my mind him going and not getting the answers he expected, finding out the man who killed his father has been long dead, and
Hmm.
there is no finding him, there is no vengeance, but yet it
Mm.
taking him off on some other track where he looks up to another idol of his and becomes the next Jane Forrest writer, trying to do something
Mm.
with his
Yeah, yeah.
life.
Yeah, he's gonna have to find some other purpose.
I could almost imagine him not the Finn not telling him that the man who killed his father is dead, but
Mm.
giving him something cryptic so he thinks that's what he's doing, but he goes off and lives some other adventure and finds his life fulfilled in other ways. But eventually finding out that man is dead and has been, since long before the last battle. Yeah, again,
Yeah.
that's just pure imagination, conjecture, but man, it would make a great story. And I want things like that for him.
It would. Yeah, I'm really imagining the possibilities. Yeah, I think Oliver has a lot more complexity, and there's so much more kind of speculation and excitement surrounding his point of view than I would have guessed. Really, especially when I saw how short and how few these points of view were, I was like, I don't know that we can squeeze much out of this. When I was putting together the schedule, I was really skeptical,
Right.
but I have really enjoyed this one. I think this is a perfect little one off episode that really shows people who are not familiar with us that you can dive in anywhere to this season and get a sense of what we do.
Yes, and I've been trying to use that with people, just hey, just check out this one episode or these two episodes, and I figure they are either hooked on the series after that, or they know better than to ever approach it again.
Right,
It's according to whether we're as good as I think we are or
right.
not. But oh, I certainly do enjoy these podcasts. I learned so much from this, and I feel so much more adept at talking about the series to other people, trying to introduce people to the series, and hoping they will tune in to the show when it comes out, and that the show, I know it won't live up to the books, but if it will just reach a level high enough that it draws people to the books,
Mhm.
then I think it's well worth whatever Amazon does to create it. And I guess I should say it adds to the story. I
Mm.
don't know that it can ever reach the level of beauty and complexity and fun and sadness and everything else that the book series has. But I just hope it's good enough that it draws people to the books and they can experience all these things for themselves and hopefully enjoy it as much as all of us in the fan community here. You ready for me to close it
Sure,
out?
yeah, I thought you were
Okay.
I wasn't gonna interfere because I thought you were leading into that. I'm sorry, I wasn't
Sorry.
just
Okay.
trying to force you
No.
to.
And speaking of the fan community, I hope they will all join us next time as we cover Interlude Episode 12, where we'll begin Talmana's point of view in the prologue of A Memory of Light.
There are neither beginnings nor endings to the turning of the wheel of mind, but this is an ending. To catch a beginning next time an episode drops, subscribe to the Wheel of Mind on Podbean, Stitcher, iTunes, or Spotify. You can also find our episodes on YouTube under the channel name Lajara Dane. That's LaJaraDayne. We'd love to hear how we're doing, so please leave us some feedback and corrections and your speculations about Oliver and everything else by rating and reviewing on whichever platform you use to listen, emailing us at lajaradane@gmail.com, or finding the show account on Twitter at mind_wheel. You can also support the show and get access to some perks like live recordings or show notes. So if you want that, subscribe to us on Patreon for just $3 a month by visiting patreon.com/wheel of mind.